father went away on business, it started. Rose, Rose, make sure that the water is hot. Rose, Rose, hang my clothes up properly. Feed the chickens, bring in the eggs, and Rosy Red worked for them all day and all night. But with her, she carried always her red leather shoes. And when she was unhappy, she would put on her red leather shoes, and they would help her to dance and to sing and to make her feel just a little bit better. But one evening, the three women came to her and said, Rose, we are going to a ball. Now, make sure that you fetch fresh water and have it hot by the time we get home, because we will have been dancing a lot and we'll need to bathe our feet when we get home. Goodbye, goodbye. Help us dress. And she helped them dress, and off they went. And Rosy Red waved them goodbye and thought, a ball. I've never been to a ball. But she took the bucket and she started to make her way to the well. And she attached the bucket to the end of the rope, and then she let it down into the well. But halfway down, the rope broke, and she heard the bucket falling to the bottom of the well with a clatter and a distant splash. And she was distraught. She thought, now, what are my stepsisters going to do with me? They surely will beat me yet again. And then she put on her red leather shoes, and she remembered a song that her grandmother had taught her whenever the rope broke. And somehow the bucket came up filled with water. So she leaned over the lip of the well and she looked down, and this is the song she sang. And Aileen is going to sing it for us.
Under duress. Almonds and raisins and pomegranate red, smile little in from your well-water bed.
Well, there was a water sprite who lived at the bottom of the well. And he woke up and he was so charmed by this lovely singing that he thought, this must be Razor, grown and singing and beautiful and charming and intelligent and singing so beautifully. So he took a handful of jewels and he poured the jewels into the bucket, and he sent the bucket up. And when Razor took the bucket and she looked inside, there were jewels, and she thought quickly, and she thought, I will take these to my stepsisters, and they will be so pleased with me that they will always be kind to me from now on. And she ran back into the house just in time to see her stepmother and the two sisters coming back into the house. And she said, look what I have for you. And they took out the jewels. And they smiled at Rosy Red and they said, Rosy Red, where did you find these jewels? And she told them how the rope had broken and how the bucket had fallen. And then she taught them the song that her grandmother had taught her, and they learnt it. And they said to her, oh, Rosy Red, these are the jewels that I hid, that the three of us hid. All you are doing is giving us back our own possessions. Come to your room. And they locked her in the room and they locked the door. And then they took the bucket and they ran down to the well for more jewels. And one of the sisters hooked the bucket onto the end of the rope and lowered the rope. And then one of the sisters leaned over the well and she began to sing the song quite differently. And Zelda is going to be that stepsister and sing the song.
Almonds and raisins and pomegranate red. Smile, little imp, from your well-watered bed.
So the water sprite woke up and said, "How dare this sister sing like that? Such a croak!" And he took some slimy toads and croaking frogs and he filled the bucket and sent it up. And as soon as it got to the top, the slimy toads and croaking frogs jumped out and jumped all over the stepmother and the sisters, and they ran back to the house so angry, and they opened the door and they took Rosie Red and they dragged her to the front door and they threw her out and they bolted the great boat. And Rosie Red looked back and she felt in her pockets, and there in her pockets were her red leather shoes, and so she felt not alone. And she started to wander through the wood. And she wandered for many days, and when she was thirsty, her red leather shoes would lead her to a little stream, and when she was hungry, her red leather shoes would lead her to a tree with berries on. But one night it started to rain. So she took off her shoes and she put them in her pockets, and she wandered further and further into the forest, and she was tired, bedraggled and hungry, and there in the distance she saw a cottage with two little flames. And she crawled and crept nearer and nearer to the cottage, and then she looked in the window, and there she saw on the table 2 Shabbat candles flickering, and she knocked at the door, and a very old lady opened the door and looked at her and said, "Raisele, Raisele, mein goldene Käppele, come in, come in." And there was a wonderful reunion. But then Rosie Red felt in her pocket, and she realized that one of her red leather slippers must have fallen out because she only had one. She said, Grandmother, I must go back into the forest and find my other red slipper." And she turned towards the door, and her grandmother said, "No, look, thunder and lightning, you can't possibly go and look for your red leather slippers. Come, sit by the fire." And so the next day they hunted in the forest, and the day after that they hunted in the forest, and they could not find her red leather slipper. And after a few days there was a knock at the door, and a young man was standing there. And he said, "I am the king's son." He said, "Look, my guards have found a red leather shoe, and I have tried it on all the maidens of the village, and nobody can fit this shoe. So they also tell me that they heard a young woman singing. She must reside here." And the grandmother said, No, this is a trick to get my Raisele back to her old house where her sisters and her stepmother live. Be off with you. And he said, "No, ma'am, no. Whoever owns the slipper must be kind and intelligent and beautiful, and I love her already." And Raisele came out from her hiding place with the matching red leather slipper and showed it to the king's son. And I don't have to tell you the end of the story, but I'm going to anyway. Because there were white horses and a carriage, and Rosie Red, who was now called Raisele by the whole court, lived happily with her prince and her grandmother with her.
Yay.
Now that might seem a very simplistic story that one only tells children. And you're right. I have 2 comments to make about it. First, it was one of Elie Wiesel's favorite stories that he told. Second of all, I don't see it as much Jewish because I think she must have married out. told that story as an introduction to one that is a fairly philosophical story based on Cinderella and a very, very Jewish one. And that's the story I would like to introduce to you now, if I may, with a little bit of explanation. Do find a seat.
That's all. I've got some blocks.
There's some chairs here.
Sorry.
This story is also based on a Cinderella story, but it is found in Hasidic tales all over the world in different forms. I'm going to bring you one of them. There are three elements to the story that I think will make it more enjoyable. The first one is the Cinderella story of the three women and the shoe, which we know about. The second element is the element that comes into all folk tales about these three women, but there is a father who calls the three daughters to him and says, "How much do you love me?" Which is a pretty unfair question for anybody to ask. And the first daughter says in all these tales, "Oh, I love you," and she goes with pearls and diamonds and all, and he is well pleased, and then asks the second daughter, and then the second daughter tells him even more lies, and then he's well pleased, and then the third daughter cannot say anything. And it is this story, this folk tale, that Shakespeare based his King Lear upon. And I want to tell you very shortly what happens there, because it has so much to do with the very Jewish story that I'm going to tell you. King Lear calls his three daughters and says, "How do you love me?" And the first daughter says, "I love you more than all the stars in the sky and the worlds beyond." And she goes on, and he is well pleased and gives her a third of his kingdom. He then asks the second daughter, "How do you love me?" And she says, "Oh, my sister comes not near." And she makes the most ridiculous expositions of love. And he is well pleased, and he gives her a third of the kingdom. And then he says to his youngest daughter, "My youngest daughter, my Cordelia, my favorite, how do you love me?" And she can't express her love. I mean, isn't that so true? And he says to her, "Nothing will come of nothing," i.e. you won't get anything if you say nothing. She says eventually something that sounds crass, but when you think about it, it's vast. And then the Jewish story to come, it's different but just as deep. She says, "I love you no more and no less than is my duty. And surely when I marry, I will love my husband the more." And he is so angry that he sends her out of the kingdom, and he gives the guards, he tells the guards that should she ever come back into the kingdom, they must capture her and they must put her to death. Now, it takes 5 acts for him to realize that his 2 daughters are really nasty little bitches. And then he goes mad and wanders in the forest, and the youngest daughter in Act 5 hears what has happened, and of course she comes running back to care for her father. And he hears that she is back in the kingdom. And he hurries as a very old man to the watch house, and of course it's too late, because the guards have put her to death on his